Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's ACLU Leadership Forum. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Ben Weisner. I'm the director of the ACLU's Center for Democracy, which houses the ACLU's work on freedom of speech, immigrants' rights, voting rights, national security, and human rights. Our usual host, ACLU President Deborah Archer, is not available today, but we look forward to having her back on hosting duties for the next one. In the meantime, it's my honor to step into her place for today's discussion with two wonderful ACLU colleagues and voting rights experts, Sophia Lynn Lakin, who directs the ACLU's Voting Rights Project, and Molly McGrath, who directs the National Democracy Campaigns in our National Political Advocacy Department. Together, we're going to do a deep dive into the Supreme Court's recent redistricting decision in Louisiana, discuss how it affects our work moving forward, and preview the ACLU's most substantial election safeguarding effort in our 106-year history ahead of the 2026 midterms. Our discussion today is directly informed by all of your pre-submitted questions. But if you have new ones that arise during the program, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We reserve some time at the end for Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So let's jump right in. Sophia, there's no way to sugarcoat it. The Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act is a major setback. In Calais versus Louisiana, the court struck down Louisiana's congressional map and stripped critical federal protections put in place to combat racially discriminatory voting systems. And it opened the door for states to try to enact discriminatory maps. I know we're here to talk about solutions, but let's start with an acknowledgement of how devastating this decision was. Sophia, can you put it in context for us?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ben. The Calais decision dealt a massive blow to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the single most important tool we've had for stopping racial discriminatory maps. And I can't overstate what that law has meant. For 6 decades, the Voting Rights Act is what turned the promise of the 14th and 15th Amendment into something real. It's the reason voters of color in this country have been able to gain a say in who governs them. The reason they could actually elect candidates of their choice instead of being packed or cracked and carved into silence. Nearly every gain in representation for Black and Brown communities in our lifetimes traces back in one way or another to that law. That's what was at stake in this case, and that's what the court just put at risk. And just to be clear about the scale of the decision, and I want to point this out because I think the court wasn't clear. The majority called what it did a mere update to a framework we've relied on for decades. That's disingenuous. As Justice Kagan put it in dissent, the ruling leaves Section 2 in the redistricting context all but a dead letter. And this doesn't come from nowhere. It's the culmination of a decades-long campaign to dismantle the Voting Rights Act piece by piece. So just in plain terms, what does this mean? The court has opened the door, as you've mentioned, Ben, wide to the kind of district maps this country had before the Voting Rights Act. It will change the literal face of representation in America. This is a profound setback, and I certainly won't pretend otherwise. And this, just to be clear again, isn't just about congressional maps. I know that's what we're all focused on, but it hits representation at every level: state legislatures, city councils, school boards. And representation, of course, isn't symbolic. It's whether your kid's school gets funded, it's whether your neighborhood gets flood relief. Erase the district and you erase the power to decide any of these issues. Black and Brown communities will be hit the hardest, but I want to emphasize that this affects all of us. So yes, this is absolutely a hard moment, but absolutely none of it means that we're fighting any less. My team has been working around the clock since the decision came down, throwing everything we've got at this on top of a docket that never slowed down, an election to safeguard coming up. And watching it has been one of the most moving things that I've seen in this work to date. So one thing I will leave you with is that because what every generation that has fought for the right to vote in this country has understood is that this work was never going to end with them. The architects of the Voting Rights Act didn't build it because the fight was over. They built it knowing it would have to go on generation after generation. So that work is now ours.
Thanks for that. And I would recommend to everyone on this call reading Justice Kagan's powerful dissent in the Calais decision, which is written clearly. Um, so, Molly, the ink was barely dry on the Calais decision before Southern states raced to strip Black voters of political power. Can you speak a little about the immediate aftermath of Calais, what states have been doing, and what the impact is?
Yes, thanks, Ben, and thanks all for being here. I'm grateful to be here with you all today. So, in the immediate aftermath of Calais, we really saw that the impact here was not just in Louisiana, in the Louisiana map, but also across the South, in Tennessee, in South Carolina, in Georgia, Alabama, folks signaling either going into special sessions, reverting to old maps. But as soon as the Supreme Court lifted those guardrails of the Voting Rights Act, we saw states spring into action immediately. So, to give a little bit of an idea of what this looks like on the maps and how this has torn communities apart in the aftermath of Calais, we saw Tennessee eliminated their congressional seat in Memphis, where Black voters had the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. They cracked and carved up this district into an illogical form where we now have Black voters in Memphis stretching into a district 200 some miles away into the suburbs of Nashville. So that's what happened in Tennessee. In Louisiana, that legislature has approved a new map that eliminates one of what were two majority of Black districts. In South Carolina, we saw the state move to a map that would eliminate its one congressional district where Black voters had the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. Luckily, that was defeated. And in Georgia, we are right now getting ready for a special session that will start on June 17th, and that will be looking at possibly changing maps that would impact the 2028 election. So what this all demonstrates together is how much things have not changed in this country as far as race and racist voting practices, particularly in the South. And it also really underscores our collective determination, will, and responsibility to fight back at every single level and use every single tool that the ACLU has.
So let's talk about that. We've heard what they're doing. Now let's talk about what we're doing. Molly, I'll start with you on the political and advocacy side, and then we'll turn to Sophia for litigation.
Well, we knew Calais was coming. We had Sophia's team on the core litigation team. And so in preparing for this decision, we were looking at several different scenarios and what those plans would be in the wake of Calais. So I think of our advocacy buckets on two specific tracks. One is that immediate rapid response that we were preparing for through different scenarios in the immediate aftermath of Calais. And then the second track is this long-term play that we will continue to do to build power. So taking that first track, that rapid response track, we knew that we had to build awareness and demonstrate a strong public desire for fair maps. A lot of folks, unlike us, aren't following every Supreme Court decision or voting rights decision or piece of legislation. And so we knew that we immediately had to fill the gaps, tell the story, and demonstrate strong will and public will for fair maps. We had to show a specific line in the sand on history here. And if folks were going to vote for maps that were going to strip Black voters of power or not. And so what we did here was tactically demonstrating this through high visible activations and setting the public narrative. So what did this look like? It looks like flooding to capitals to demonstrate the masses that people are on the side of fair maps and on the side of Black voters. We had rallies outside the capitals. We had worked with partners on the ground. We had our volunteers and folks with signs that said no Jim Crow maps. We had billboards and mobile billboards, trucks circling the Capitol during these times, during these votes, to make sure that we were setting the narrative and drawing that clear line in the sand. We had staff testifying at these hearings. We filled these hearing rooms, and we also prepped volunteers to give effective testimony, share their story, and share what this meant for their community. We wanted to center the voters, center Black voters, and center what this meant for political power. And then we also wanted to make sure that this was part of the national public narrative. We did this through a series of op-eds, through earned media, and to raise awareness nationally on what the political context for this meant, not just in Louisiana, but across the country and in the South. And then we did a lot of direct to our legislature activations. An example of this is in Tennessee alone, we did almost 1,500 patch-through calls to targeted legislatures. In South Carolina, we had digital ads and ran about 7,000 emails to targeted lawmakers there. We also culminated this in a large activation in Alabama that was attended by about 5,000 people with 700 ACLU members RSVPing. This was All Roads to Alabama. It was held in Montgomery, which is really holy land for the civil rights movement. And we were honored to be partnered in planning with Black Voters Matter and other folks on the ground to execute this event. We deployed 10 staff and had our affiliate representatives speak there and share their stories and share what this means for representation in the South on the ground. So as we think of what's next up after this immediate rapid response narrative setting and those legislative fights and that specific advocacy feat in the South Carolina legislature, now we're moving to that long term, to that power build. We know that we need, that this is, as Sophia said, this is a generational fight. This is a long game. And so we'll be working this summer to continue this momentum with groups like Black Voters Matter, with our affiliates on the ground, to continue to do a summer of action, up Know Your Rights work, and also we'll be doing GOTV around this. One byproduct of this is a lot of voter confusion on an election, a new map, possibly a new polling location, and we want to make sure that we have clear information to voters about what their rights are and the enthusiasm to vote this year.
Thanks for that, Molly. I can't think of a more powerful distillation than no Jim Crow maps. Sophia, we've gotten a lot of questions about whether litigation is still a viable tool after Calais. I think you and I believe that it is, but I'd love to let everybody else hear your view of that.
Yes, litigation is still a tool, and it's still a sharp one. One thing I will flag is, we saw this coming for 2 years. Calais was, first up at the Supreme Court, then was issued for re-argument, so we've had some time to prepare. We've been doing the unglamorous work of Calais proofing, building records, lining up plaintiffs, working with our analytics team and organizers on the ground. So when the ruling came down, whatever the ruling was, we weren't starting from zero. But, here's what I think gets lost a little bit in the headlines. Yes, the court really gutted Section 2, but only for redistricting as well, right? That's one tool in one context. That didn't end the fight, and they didn't touch other tools that we have. So, for example, we still have the Constitution, the US Constitution itself, and with it, claims of intentional discrimination. When a state draws a map to strip Black voters or other voters of color on purpose, that's unconstitutional, and we can prove it. We have state constitutions, many of which protect the vote more strongly than the federal one, and include things like bans on partisan gerrymandering. We have a growing number of states that have their own voting rights acts. Some provisions will be probably challenged in light of Calais, and we're seeing that already, but they don't rise and fall in lockstep with the federal statute and remain protections that we can use. So this is what we did sort of in the aftermath to your earlier question. We went all in to hold the line for 2026, to stop them where we could and to curb the worst of it everywhere we could. In the aftermath of the decision, as Molly flagged, states across the South began suspending primaries, forcing through new maps, trying to lock in the damage before the ink was dry. And we fought to disrupt them at every turn. And where we couldn't stop them outright through litigation and all the advocacy on the groundwork that we did, the threat of litigation became more than a lawsuit, right? It became an organizing moment, a reason for people to show up, to name what was happening, and to shame the legislators using this ruling as a cover for a raw power grab against voters of color. And, I'll be honest with everyone here, most of these fights in the courts, in the immediate aftermath, we haven't won, at least not yet. But a case you haven't won isn't a fight that you've lost. Let's look at what happened just in the congressional maps in some of the areas that Molly just mentioned. In Tennessee, Our challenge to the erasure of the state's only majority Black district is still alive. Our injunction, our preliminary injunction motion is still pending, and we're going to fight like hell for it. In Alabama, the Supreme Court, in a very shameful ruling, has let the state reinstate a map that a district court had already found was intentionally racially discriminatory, but it's just for now. In Louisiana, the organizing and the threat of litigation are part of the story of why the legislature pulled back from going all the way, settling for a 5-1 map as opposed to a 6-0 map that it was threatening. And in South Carolina, the legislature actually abandoned its redraw for this election entirely, mostly thanks to all that organizing and advocates on the ground. But they also cited the threat of litigation and the memory of how painful the last round was when we brought it back a few years ago. So that's what holding the line looks like right now. Not every fight won, but everyone made, costly, slowed down, and dragged into the light. And one other thing I wanted to flag, it's easy to forget in the middle of all this, that Calais is about one thing, and that's redistricting. On that front, it's absolutely a devastating blow, as I mentioned, but redistricting, and we'll get to this more, isn't the whole fight for the right to vote. And on the other fronts, we're not just holding the line, we're winning. Take the Justice Department's push to seize voters' sensitive personal data. They've demanded it from 30 states or 29 states and District of Columbia. We've taken legal action in 25 of those cases, and so far, every single court to rule has sided with the voters, not the DOJ. We recently beat back a documentary proof of citizenship requirement in New Hampshire, and we won in state court in Montana, stopping an effort to end same-day registration, a lifeline in particular for Native American communities, and that's just within the last couple of weeks. The fight is certainly harder than it was before Calais, but harder certainly doesn't mean over, and we've certainly faced long odds before. We're certainly not standing down today.
And I can say, Sophia, that the whole staff is so inspired by the work that your team has done the last few weeks. I keep getting messages from colleagues asking how they can send cookies to the voting rights litigators. Molly, you talked about the organizing that your team has been doing after Calais. Can you give us some more information about the advocacy team's affirmative work on the policy fights?
Yes. On advocacy and policies, we especially look to effectuate legislative change or implement policy that would be in this proactive posture and pro-voting posture. We take a landscape view at the map and look at several different ways that we can do this. This could be through ballot measures, if the state allows those ballot measures that perhaps implement an independent redistricting commission or otherwise depoliticize the map drawing process and enshrine those protections into the state constitution. We use legislation. We've been fighting and will continue to fight for state VRAs to double down on that protection in the state legislature. And we also are continuing and will continue our long-term fight for federal voter protections and a proactive voter agenda that sets standards nationally across the country. So we know that these takes a lot of legislation, and passing legislation doesn't happen overnight. So with this, we also do a lot of on the ground organizing, that socializing of these policies. So on one arm, we're writing the policies and making these as protective and proactive to voters as possible. And then on the other arm, we are doing that communications, that organizing work on the ground to socialize the reforms, build momentum toward these reforms so we can really demonstrate and also deploy that public demand for these changes.
Thanks for that. Back to you, Sophia, as we listen to all of this, what is this fight asking of the rest of us? What do you most need people in this Zoom room to understand about this moment?
Yeah, so let me start with one thing that I want people in this room to understand that I think maybe gets a little bit lost in some of the conversation because everything else flows from it. People of color should never have to depend on the goodwill of the very legislators they're trying to hold accountable in order to protect their own voice. Think about how backwards that is. We're asking the people who benefit from a rigged map to volunteer to unrig it. that's not a plan. That's a problem. And so what people need really are rights they can that they can actually hold on to, durable, enforceable protections that don't vanish the moment a court turns or a legislature flips. And securing those takes more than any one lawsuit. It takes a reinvigorated, re-energized civil rights movement, one that brings together all people of conscience. And I've been sort of proselytizing this view for since the Kelly decision came down. And a movement like this asks something from every single one of us. And there are three things that I want to highlight that we refuse to let this happen quietly, that we stay in it for the long haul, and that we resource it like the emergency that it really is. So first, refuse to let this happen quietly. Don't look away. Most people don't feel a redistricting ruling the day it comes down. They feel it later, right? So when the funding for their kids' schools dries up, when the clinic closes, when the representative who actually knew their neighborhood is gone and the new one has never set foot in it. The harm is real, but it's slow, and the slow harm is easy for all of us to ignore. So we're putting the people living it in front and center. We're working with Molly's team in our policy department and our communications team across the South, because the story of what's at stake can't come from a lawyer in a suit. It has to come from the people it's happening to. And it falls on all of us to make those stories impossible to look away from. Second, we got to stay in this for the long haul. This is a long fight that we're looking for. We are trying to hold that line in 2026 as best we can, but we're already building for 2028 and beyond, as Molly sort of flagged already. Litigation, as I mentioned, it's never going to be the whole answer, but it holds the door open long enough for the slower work to take hold. The organizing, the ballot initiatives, the state constitutional amendments, congressional action. The fight doesn't end on a single election night, and it asks us not to treat it like it will. Third, we got to resource this. The cavalry isn't coming. The big law firms that used to show up for this work aren't riding in to save it right now. Some have been bullied into silence. Others have simply decided it isn't worth the risk. So right now, voting rights organizations like ours are carrying this on our own backs. The depositions, the experts, the appeals, the years each case takes, it's enormously resource intensive. And that bill doesn't pause just because the Supreme Court made the work harder. We can do this. We've been doing this. We are doing this, but we can't do it alone. Your support is absolutely a part of how this all gets done. The complaint filed before the primary locks in, the expert who takes the stand to prove discrimination, the lawyer still there in year 3, long after the other side assumed we'd be worn down. So this is one of those moments that decides whether the line holds. And we are using every tool in the toolbox to hold it, and we're happy to do it in partnership with all of you.
Yeah, just another word about how important your support is. This organization has filed 190 lawsuits since Trump took office a second time. That number keeps going up because we keep having to file new ones and the old ones don't go away. So we really do need that support. You've both mentioned that the fight over maps is only part of the picture in protecting free and fair elections. So, Molly, maybe you could preview for this group that we have been planning for a whole host of scenarios, and you could give a snapshot of our safeguarding action plan.
Yes. So as we move into the election and some of the threats that we expect to see, particularly this election cycle, we are doing a host of tactics, preparation, refining strategies at the national and affiliate level in order to be prepared both to effectively and quickly react to any one threat, and also to mitigate at the front end, to be engaging in proactive steps, building programs now to minimize the occurrence or damage of any one threat that we are expecting this election cycle. So our advocacy or our playbook is one of the core tools that we have used to do this. It is an example of our multifunctional ACLU program, we have aligned on there are 25 different threats that you see here. And I warn you that once you see this, you can't unsee it because they'll be melted in your brain. But rest assured, because we truly do have a plan for that. So as you look at this, we have aligned on threats that we're preparing for from the pre-voting period all the way through the seating. And so some of these you'll see are typical classic election protection type of threats. If we look at the bucket during voting, we have non-nefarious issues. We have the traditional voter suppression tactics. We have voter purges, things that are bread and butter ACLU issues that we have been working on for decades. But we also have, as we know, a new genre of threats this year. We have work that continues after voting, into counting, into the declaration of the winner, that type of work that is new in the last several election cycles, that lack or threat of certification, those challenges during counting. We are preparing for that post-election period as well, and then all the way to seating. So in addition to that timeline, we also have some specific threats that we are preparing for this year and that are new to the 2026 landscape. And that looks like huge amounts of mis and disinformation, in particular from an administration that will weaponize the government to sow chaos and build distrust in our election system. And so this is a box in and of itself, because truly it is an evergreen threat that has started months ago, has started a long time ago, and that we are preparing to continue to fight this narrative and build trust in our election system, ensure voters have trust in the election system, and also vote and volunteer with us as well. So that is one example of a particular 2026 unique threat. Another example would be voter intimidation at the polls. We've heard of this, both that used to be with private actors, and now in particular, we're preparing for minimizing the threat of state-sanctioned federal deployment of ICE or other troops at the polls, and what that looks like, both to minimize the threat in front of time and to react in real time. So as we have these numbers of threats, we have prepared playbooks across Sophia's team in litigation, with our communication experts, with my team in policy and organizing, and folks on the ground, and we are operationalizing this. We are doing scenario planning in states with affiliates, making sure that we are prepared to act as strong and quickly as we possibly can, paying attention to the unique threats in that ecosystem in those states and our unique role as the ACLU. And I can say one thing that makes me so proud, not just about kind of this playbook and how we've built this out, but also just being able to work at the ACLU, is that we really have so many levers to pull here. And I'm so grateful to be able to have this, to be able to do this work with Sophia and our other colleagues, that as we prepare these threats, our answer isn't just one particular lane. Our answer is, what does this look like for litigation? What does this look like for a policy ask that we can make ahead of time? How can we respond with our creative strategic communications and make sure we're getting the message out at scale? And also, we have folks on the ground. We have our amazing affiliates, and we also have volunteers. And what are we asking folks to do? And so for us, we feel really grateful to be able to do this work at the ACLU, and we also absolutely feel our responsibility to this work, to the voters that we're fighting for, and to each other as we embark on this election cycle.
Thanks so much for that, Molly. Simultaneously chilling and reassuring. Sophia, when you look at the parade of horribles on that last slide, how is your team already responding to and planning to respond to some of those scenarios?
Yeah, so Molly named all of these, and I want to go a little bit deeper and talk a little bit more about some of the ones that I think are on folks' mind as a way to talk about what we've already been doing and how we're thinking about it. There's the threats that we've always fought from states, from counties, from private actors, where those are still here. In some places they're getting worse, but let's focus on the what's new in 2026 for a second, because what we haven't seen in the modern voting rights era is this gravest threats are now coming from the federal government itself, right? And that's what everyone's worried about. The White House issuing orders aimed squarely at the vote, the Justice Department turning its civil rights machinery against voters And in Congress, the drive to write new proof of citizenship barriers into federal law and all the other things that they are considering. Three branches of federal government pushing the same direction at once, layered on top of everything we were already fighting, is kind of the moment we're in. But let me just make two of these things a little bit more concrete in how we're addressing them. So let's start with executive power. The president has become the country's loudest source of false narratives about our elections, and he's turning them into action. Executive orders going after mail voting and citizen checks, directing agencies like the Postal Service to throttle the system from the inside. And, there's also the question I get a lot of, right, that we talked about. Could we see federal agents, ICE, used to intimidate voters at or near the polls? It's a real concern, and we're certainly watching for it very, very closely. Then the Justice Department turned against people it was built to protect. The voter data demands I talked a little bit about earlier, going out to dozens of states, aren't random, right? They're the building blocks of a federal voter database that the suppression movement has been wanting for years. Assemble it, and you've got the leverage to push states into mass purges and error-ridden criminal referrals. And the data is just only the opening move. We're already seeing the groundwork laid in Fulton County in Georgia, in Maricopa in Arizona, in Wayne County in Michigan, to reach for the ballots in the machines themselves, which would put election officials in an impossible position and, of course, put our elections at risk. So after laying that all out for you, I just want to know that I'm aware and naming these concerns. Here's why I'm not standing up here in despair. We have a strong foundation to fight every piece of this. And Molly's already talked about some of how we're working in tandem, in hand to use every tool together to meet these needs. So I'll talk a little bit about the piece that I'm focused on. On the executive orders, the Constitution gives authority over federal elections to Congress and the states, not the president. He has no power to rewrite the rules of an election by decree. That isn't our hope. That is the Constitution. It's the theory courts already accepted when they blocked key parts of his first executive order, and we're applying it to the second, and we're still waiting on a ruling there. On federal agents at the polls, the law is squarely on our side. There are strong, long-standing protections against voter intimidation and election interference, and we will enforce every one of them where we can and need to. And on the demands for things for voter data, we're not waiting. Those cases are already in court, and so far as I've mentioned, we're winning them. The Justice Department is currently 0 and 8 in these cases. For everything, for each one of these issues that I've talked about, for everything else that we've been preparing for a while, the certification questions and the like, complaints and templates are already drafted. We've reviewed them. We're getting ready to file them if necessary. So that's what preparedness looks like. It's not bravado. It's not panics. So when one of these comes for real, we're not reacting. We're executing.
I think the difference between being outside the ACLU and inside the ACLU is we all see the same news, but on the inside, we have a front row seat to what we're doing about it. Thanks so much for that. Molly, we've got a lot of questions from people about how they can get involved. I know we already have an army of 3,000 volunteers who are being trained to enforce fair voting and certification. Can you share more about our organizing efforts?
Yes. And as Ben earlier said, this is really the largest safeguarding program in the ACLU's history, in large part because of this incredible field program, all the volunteers, and the builds that we are doing on the ground. So I think of our field program and what folks can do to get involved in a few different buckets. One are these observers that Ben mentioned. We will be recruiting, training, and deploying 3,000 plus election volunteer observers. And as we all know, these laws and what these observers do is different from state to state. But in general, this looks like poll monitoring from the voting period, that period on our threat index from early vote on election day, And then in that post-election period, we are sending folks to counties to monitor those canvases, that counting process, that certification, and ensure that votes are fairly counted and then also certified. So from the county to the Congress level, we are here for that post-election period and monitoring and ensuring that votes are fairly counted during that time. We saw in Wayne County in 2020 the impact of ensuring that we have eyes and ears and folks trained and prepared in this post-election period. And so we are building that at scale and throughout several additional geographies with organizers on the ground and through that heavy recruitment. But we're not waiting till September. We have a huge field program that is starting now. So we have folks, volunteers, and year-round engagement in many states like Michigan, like Georgia, where folks are going regularly to the local county election meetings as eyes and ears and advocating for pro-voter policies. We have Civics 101 trainings and Power to Purpose trainings on the ground, priming folks for what to expect this election cycle and coming in up the ladder of engagement with us and into those state-specific programs and what is most needed in that state-specific ecosystem. So that's our field observer program and that kind of local county program. Second bucket that we're getting ready for is the need for mobilization and mass mobilization in that post-election period. How are we going to demonstrate demand for fair election results and the certification and enforcement of a free and fair election in the post-election period? So we're getting ready for that. And then the third bucket here that is really important is all of our voter facing work and what our volunteers and what we as the ACLU are doing as it appears to voters. So there's a few things that are really important, especially this year, to the threats that we indexed for 2026. One is upping and really having a robust Know Your Rights program. As we talked about in particular, say the threat of voter intimidation at the polls. We want to make sure that voters know their rights to vote free from intimidation, that they know their rights to vote early, that we are encouraging folks to vote early if that's available in their state and or return their ballot early. And so making sure that people have the confidence to vote and know their rights is essential this year more than ever. And so we'll be doing national webinars on Know Your Rights. And then we also have organizers on the ground, both from our affiliates and deployed organizers from national, who will be organizing on the ground, in particular in partnerships with our affiliates and those organizations that serve voters who are most likely to be targeted by intimidation. So Know Your Rights is one bucket of those events. We'll also be doing joyful GOT events around the early voting period. We know how essential early voting is this year, so we are going to ensure that voters have a day where they can vote with excitement, with joy, if they do decide to vote in person and if that is available in their state. We will be planning those on the ground, especially in our core states this year with the early voting push. So all of this really shows that safeguarding this election it's really up to all of us, whether it's signing up to be that poll monitor, the post-election period, whether it's attending a Know Your Rights call that we have, or sharing a Know Your Rights graphic on your social media, whatever that is, big or small, that this election especially is, it's certainly up to the ACLU, but it's also up to every single one of us to engage. And there's room for everyone and there's really need for everybody.
Thanks so much, Molly, and thanks also to you, Sophia. Let's turn now to Q&A. We've already tried to fold in questions as they've come in, but everyone should feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom to ask more. One warning, there may be questions we can't get to today, so we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. And as always, if we don't get to some, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the event. Makiba, could you share the first batch of questions?
Sure. So the first question is from Richard about the Postal Service and new standards, including the ballot envelope design and review. Is this an unconstitutional federal intrusion of a state's system of election? What's your view? On coalition, Larry asks whether the ACLU is working in coalition, especially in national voter protection efforts, or on a local level, should we be prepared to join multiple national coalitions and report to multiple national registries? And then on Calais, is there anything Congress can do to reverse the Supreme Court's decision and/or introduce legislation that might re-empower communities affected by this decision?
So we have coalitions, Calais, and the Postal Service. How about Sophia? Do you want to start with Calais and what Congress can do? And then maybe Molly, you can take on coalitions and we'll go back to Sophia for Postal Service.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, to the question regarding Calais, there are many things that Congress can do to, at the very least, mitigate some of the excesses here. So one very simple thing, simple I say, but one thing that's been in the hopper for some time that at the very least I think will cabin some of the worst abuses of power here is a ban on partisan gerrymandering. It's not going to stop every one of these areas that we're concerned about when it comes to voters of color, but it certainly will, I think, rein in some of the worst impulses. There's more work that's being done with respect to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which contains a number of things that would restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act, not just in the wake of Calais, but also going farther back to what Brnovich did, an earlier case from 2019 that dealt a different blow to the Voting Rights Act and the like. So there are already things that we've been working on for some time and that we are going to be revisiting in light of Calais as a coalition to the other coalition question with other voting rights partners to make sure, that we're thinking through everything and, to what extent creating a new set of protections that can withstand the test of time in light of what's we've been facing.
So Molly, how is someone to navigate all of the voting rights groups in this space? Are we lone wolves or are we working together?
No, we are not lone wolves. We work in coalition at every level. And this is a really great question. So at the national level, our teams work directly with partners who are all engaged in the pro-voter movement, have these same goals. And then at the affiliate level, there are also coalitions of a lot of the same goals and partners. And so we are working together to ensure that we are being as efficient, as strategic, and using our resources to the maximum and most strategic extent possible. And so an example of what this would look like, say if you volunteer to be a poll monitor in a certain state and you sign up with the ACLU. And the ACLU in some states is the poll monitor at early voting and election day. And in some states, they do more of that post-election period. But our coalition, we work in coalition to ensure that we are putting volunteers and slotting them into the places where it makes sense for that volunteer. So if that volunteer wants to do election day protection, we'll work with our coalition partners to ensure that you are dispatched and deployed on election day. And we're also making sure that with these people resources that we are being as efficient as possible and working in coalition to not duplicate efforts and have multiple volunteers from different organizations at the same place, but instead how are we pooling and making sure that we are being efficient, covering as many polling locations as possible, and streamlining those communications, those reactions to the extent possible. So it's definitely a team effort, and it is truly just downright organizing in a lot of these field programs.
Thanks.
And
Yeah, go ahead,
the
Sophia.
USPS. So I absolutely agree that the president's attempt to essentially compel the USPS to become a gatekeeper in many ways of the right to vote is unconstitutional. And we are in court right now challenging that executive order with our partners in the District of Massachusetts. We had a preliminary injunction hearing, a hearing to put a hold on the USPS provision of that executive order on mail voting last week, today, in the District of Massachusetts, and we are awaiting a ruling in that case right now. So the main theory, we have a few others, but the main theory against that provision is that it violates the separation of powers, as I flagged earlier, the Constitution is pretty clear on this. The president doesn't get to rewrite the rules of elections. That's the state's primary authority with the backstop of Congress.
Okay, I think we're ready for more questions, Makiba.
All right, so for this next batch, we have a question from Jeff. Does the Constitution still protect voting rights against intentional discrimination on voting rights given the shadow docket decision on the Alabama case? From Ginny, if we live in a state not affected or not yet affected by these state redistricting actions, what can we do to take action in support of our Black and Brown communities in affected states? And then finally, from Benjamin, my state already capitulated and sent voter registration lists to the federal government. Is there any indication of what the federal government is planning on doing with these? And what should people from these states be looking out for?
All right, well, thanks for those great questions. Why don't we take them in order this time? So, Sophia, what are we to make of Calais plus Alabama? What is the standard, and how can we prove intentional discrimination? And does it even matter?
It absolutely matters, and we absolutely can still prove intentional discrimination. In the Alabama case that was referenced is a case that is challenging the state's congressional map. We brought this case in 2021, litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court multiple times. And in the most recent iteration, we brought back up to the Supreme Court an attempt to pause a reinstatement of this prior map that was found intentionally discriminatory on the so-called shadow docket, right? So this is all in a early posture. Nothing has been fully litigated. There's still an opportunity to have that fulsome evidentiary back and forth. And so this went up to the Supreme Court, which had literally just sent it back down to the district court in light of Calais. And the court said, again, there, that at least on this preliminary record, we think that it's okay for the reinstatement of the map to move forward. We're going to block the lower court's ruling, trying to block that. Block and block. I know multiple negatives. So it's not a final statement from the court. There was, barely any text, as many of these shadow docket rulings are about, and we don't know, what every justice thinks about this, but we are still going to move forward with proving our case on the merits with a full record, a full trial below. So we are going to have every opportunity to put forward this record building that we've been creating along the way to make our case on intentional discrimination, which Calais itself did not discuss or touch. So anything that's being said, at least on the shadow docket right now, isn't controlling in the same way that the Calais decision would be.
And there's always the Constitution, right? Molly, if we don't live in Alabama, what actions can we take to support the communities there?
That's a great question. I can think of three things. One is we know that we need fixes for the long haul here too. And so that would be that federal legislation that Sophia referenced, what this looks like in John Lewis, what this looks like in a freedom to vote, what this looks like for these other protections. That is going to be part of the next chapter of the work that we need to have every state, no matter what, has to push their reps on. Second is the public awareness on this. A poll that we did really indicated and demonstrated the information gap from what happened, what the Supreme Court did, how that was connected to the redistricting, and what some of the solutions are and what the impact is for voters in the South. So the conversations that we have with friends, family, our social media, how we're being ambassadors ourselves for the impact of this and what it looks like, and encouraging folks to get involved is a second. And the third, I would say, is we are looking at what our program as far as that getting out the vote for Black voters in the South and ensuring they know their rights to vote this election cycle, especially amidst all of the confusion that has happened in this fallout. And so, volunteering with us, another organization who is engaged in that activity, a lot of that can be done remotely as well. through texting, phone banking, and the like.
Great. Sophia, do you have any idea why the Department of Justice is trying to grab all these voter rolls, and what are they going to do? What are they trying to do?
So fortunately, in terms of that question, they've been maybe not the Department of Justice specifically all the time, but certainly their bosses have been very clear with what they've been attempting to accomplish with pulling all this data together. And that is to create this national database of voters and to push for very aggressive voter purges using methodology and data sources, combining all this data, how do you match them and the like, almost always results in massive error rates because these systems aren't designed to be used in this fashion. So sort of just a systemic problem, which is why there are guardrails in place to prevent these kind of mass purges using these systematic ways so that voters aren't caught in a position of being purged from the rolls and only finding out when it's too late. So there are usually notice provisions if you're going to get removed. There's a quiet period before massive purges can take place before any federal election. And the other sort of piece of this is the investigatory piece, right? They've indicated both the Department of Justice, but the president and other members of senior administration members have said, this can be used as a tool for investigation, right? We might use this to investigate so-called voter fraud. We might use this to investigate individual voters. And whether that leads to prosecution sort of is not the point. That's that threat that is behind so much of what this administration is doing that may cause fear and concern amongst voters. So a couple of things to the question of, what can be done about this? You live in a state that has already, turned over data. One is, I would say, you should know that we have a lawsuit challenging the accrual of this data in DC and how they're pulling together this data. So that lawsuit is proceeding, and we're moving as quickly as we can to try to put a halt on this sort of amassing of data in the federal government. Second, I'd say you should always be checking your registration. We have this, voter plan, know what you're doing, making sure you're checking your voter registration, making sure you have a plan to vote. And if you are, for some reason, pulled off the rolls when you shouldn't be, you definitely need to go and register to vote. So make sure you're checking before voter registration deadlines are in your state. That's the critical important. And I would say, do not be afraid. Do not let this work and prevent you from voting, or prevent other people from voting. That is absolutely the number one thing I want everyone to take away from any of these conversations, that we need to go vote this November, and make sure 10 of your friends are voting as well.
Thanks for that. I think we have time for a few more questions. I see the engagement is really high. I see almost 50 questions in the Q&A. And just a reminder that if obviously we can't get to them all today, we will follow up. Makiba, the next tranche.
Sure. So this is our last batch of questions, and we'll only have two. The first question is, on the midterms, we received a lot of questions and fears about the election not happening at all. Sophia, could you talk to us through what that would actually entail? And then from Sandra, we would like to learn more about our longer-term solutions beyond the midterms and what we can do to counteract the longer-term structural changes that will make it harder to win in 2028 and beyond.
So, Sophia, are we even going to have an election? This is my favorite question.
Yes. So I have two responses to that. I mean, the first one is that, look, there wouldn't be these threats to voting. There wouldn't be this massive push to try to intimidate people into not voting if your voice did not have power. If we're going to have elections and there is a fear that you're going to vote your values, that's number one. Number two is, as a practical matter, this is nearly impossible to achieve, right, for 2026. So while the president may say, hey, I would love for the elections to stop, there's no practical way to make that happen, right? Because at the end of the day, states are the ones that control the election. So while Trump may say he would like the elections to be canceled, can you imagine California agreeing to do this, or New York, or any state for that matter, who wants to have representatives in Congress, at the state legislature and the like, to do the work of people? So I think those are the two answers that I would give, both sort of just as a very real um, uh, uh, a real sort of gut feeling about the fact that we wouldn't be doing any of this if elections aren't going to go forward, right? We wouldn't be going through the threat to voters. And then, of course, the practical aspects, I hope, will give you some comfort that this is very, very difficult, if impossible, to achieve without the cooperation of states that have given every indication that they are fighting back.
Okay. And Molly, do you want to uh, talk a little bit about how we are thinking about our long-term strategy in response to um, structural hurdles and obstacles?
Yes. So as we think about what we're doing in 2026 and how it relates to 2028 and beyond, for us at the ACLU as a nonpartisan organization, winning for us is ensuring that all eligible voters can vote, their votes are counted, those results are honored, and those results are certified. And so for us, as we're thinking about our long-term strategy and the immediate fights before us, we're thinking of it in a few ways. One, as it relates to 2026, this is really a dress rehearsal in some ways to demonstrate strong public demand for free and fair elections and honoring results. And so that's why we are building this robust program, including mobilization, including what it takes to organize on the ground and have that public demand, so that the swell and demand for fair elections is so loud, so boisterous, that it deters any sort of election subversion or attempts of election subversion as we move into the next election cycle. So that's one way of how we're thinking about both kind of the short and long-term fight on election subversion as it relates to the next few cycles. And then when it comes to the policy and the structural reform that we need, that looks like some of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, some of those protections for voters of color. It looks like some Freedom to Vote Act and, say, structural reform like independent redistricting commission options at states. It looks like current legislation that bans mid-cycle redistricting. So we know that we have a lot of work to do to protect our democracy and have it. Our democracy has never been perfect, and it will be something that we will continue to fight for and improve. And those are some of the longer arc fights and policy proposals that we're looking at as we prepare to get ready federally, and then also looking at these at the state level as it relates to state VRAs, as it relates to pro-voter policies like same-day registration, that allow all voters to vote, register and vote on election day, and is particularly helpful for transient voters, low-income voters, voters of color, and students in traditionally marginalized communities. So we're going to keep, walk. What's the saying? Walk and chew gum at the same time. So we're going to be doing that both with what we need to do with the fight ahead of us, and then we are continuing to build for what we need in the long haul, as well.
Well, thanks again to both of you for a really inspiring hour. And thanks to everyone for joining us today and sharing your questions. Again, if we didn't get to your question, and we may not have, please feel free to email us at leadershipforum@aclu.org, and that address is in the chat. I so appreciate all of you taking the time to come together today to support our work. Courage is contagious, and it is a real boost to us to be in community with some of our strongest supporters. So thank you again, and see you next time.